The screech of brakes pierced the morning air like a banshee's wail. Time seemed to suspend itself as I watched the 18-wheeler barrel toward my sedan at the intersection. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 34 years old. Or at least, I was 34 when this nightmare began. The impact came with a violence that shattered not just glass and metal, but the very foundation of who I thought I was. My world exploded into a symphony of crushing steel and my own screams. When consciousness finally returned 3 days later, the sterile smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils. Tubes snaked from my arms like mechanical vines, and the steady beeping of monitors created an electronic heartbeat. Dr. Martinez stood at the foot of my bed, his expression grave behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Sarah, you've suffered severe trauma," he said, his voice carrying the weight of difficult news. "Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and significant spinal cord damage. We need to discuss your future." The ceiling tiles became my constant companions as I lay there, unable to move from the chest down. Phantom sensations danced through legs I could no longer feel, cruel reminders of what I'd lost. Nurses came and went like ghosts, their whispered conversations floating just beyond my understanding. My parents sat beside me, their faces etched with worry and false optimism. "You're going to get through this, sweetheart," Mom whispered, but her eyes betrayed her fear. I wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. Physical therapy sessions became torture disguised as hope. Therapists would move my lifeless legs through motions my brain commanded, but my body couldn't obey. The frustration burned like acid in my chest, eating away at my spirit one failed attempt at a time. Other patients in the rehabilitation ward became silent witnesses to my struggle, their own battles creating an atmosphere of shared desperation. Some recovered and walked away, literally. Others, like me, faced a different kind of future, one measured in wheelchair accessibility rather than steps taken. The nights were the worst, when darkness amplified my fears and regrets. I'd lie awake staring at nothing, my mind racing through all the what-ifs that tortured my soul. What if I'd left the house 5 minutes later? What if I'd taken a different route to work? What if I'd been more careful at that intersection? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, consuming my thoughts and leaving little room for anything else. Sleep became my enemy, filled with dreams where I could still run and dance. Visitors came less frequently as weeks turned into months, their initial shock and sympathy fading into awkward small talk and uncomfortable silences. Friends found excuses to stay away, unable to confront the reality of what had happened to me. My boyfriend Mark tried to maintain normalcy, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the way he struggled to look at me in the wheelchair. "It doesn't change anything," he insisted, but we both knew that was a lie. Everything had changed. I was no longer the Sarah he'd fallen in love with. The mirror became my enemy, reflecting a stranger with hollow eyes and a body that no longer obeyed my will. Physical therapy continued with mechanical persistence, but hope had become a foreign concept. Other patients spoke of small victories and gradual progress, but my body remained stubbornly unresponsive. The doctor's optimism faded into professional courtesy, their treatments becoming routine rather than revolutionary. Medical bills piled up like autumn leaves, each one a reminder of the financial burden my condition imposed on my family. Insurance companies spoke in percentages and limitations. As I lay there in that hospital bed, tubes still invading my body and machines still monitoring my every breath, something unexpected happened. My mind began to wander backward, seeking refuge in memories that predated this catastrophe. Perhaps it was the medication, or perhaps it was my soul's way of protecting itself from the harsh present. I found myself traveling through time, revisiting moments from my past with startling clarity. The journey began at the beginning, with memories so vivid they felt more real than the sterile hospital room around me. Years seemed to compress into heartbeats as I remembered being 5 years old, standing on a chair in my grandmother's kitchen. Her weathered hands guided mine as we kneaded dough for mooncakes, the sweet smell of lotus paste filling the air. "Patience, little one," she whispered in Mandarin, her voice like silk over steel. "The best things in life require time and care." I didn't understand then how prophetic those words would become. Grandma's wrinkled face crinkled with joy as I attempted to shape the dough, my chubby fingers creating more mess than masterpiece. My childhood unfolded like a photograph album in my mind, each memory crisp and detailed despite the passage of time. Elementary school brought its own challenges and triumphs, from struggling with multiplication tables to winning the 5th grade spelling bee. I remembered the weight of my backpack, heavy with textbooks and dreams, as I walked the 6 blocks to school each morning. Friends came and went like seasons, some leaving indelible marks on my young heart. Mrs. Patterson, my 3rd grade teacher, saw something special in me and encouraged my love of writing. "You have a gift, Sarah," she told me one afternoon. Middle school arrived like an awkward thunderstorm, bringing confusion, hormones, and the first stirrings of independence. My body changed faster than my confidence could keep up, leaving me feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The popular kids seemed to possess some secret knowledge about how to navigate these treacherous social waters, while I floundered between childhood and something resembling adulthood. My first crush, Tommy Martinez, had dark eyes and a crooked smile that made my heart race. I spent countless hours perfecting love letters I'd never have the courage to deliver, practicing conversations in the mirror that would never take place. High school brought its own unique brand of chaos and revelation. Academic pressure mounted like a gathering storm, with college applications looming over every decision. I threw myself into extracurricular activities with the fervor of someone trying to build the perfect resume for an uncertain future. The school newspaper became my refuge, where I could lose myself in stories about pep rallies and budget cuts instead of worrying about standardized test scores. Late nights in the journalism room, surrounded by the smell of printer ink and the clicking of keyboards, felt like home. My editor, Ms. Rodriguez, pushed me to dig deeper, to ask harder questions. High school graduation arrived with all the pomp and circumstance that such milestones deserve. Cap and gown felt like a costume I was wearing to play the role of someone ready for the next chapter. The principal's speech about bright futures and endless possibilities rang hollow in my ears, though I smiled and applauded on cue. My parents beamed with pride from the audience, their cameras flashing like paparazzi documenting a celebrity sighting. College acceptance letters had already determined my next destination, Berkeley, where I'd study journalism with dreams of changing the world one story at a time. The summer between high school and college stretched before me like an uncharted ocean, full of potential and uncertainty. Berkeley's campus overwhelmed me with its sheer size and energy, thousands of students moving with purpose I hadn't yet discovered. My dorm room was a box barely large enough for 2 beds and 2 desks, but it represented freedom in a way I'd never experienced. My roommate Jessica was from Montana, and she brought stories of wide-open spaces that made my suburban upbringing seem small by comparison. Late-night conversations revealed dreams and fears we'd never shared with anyone else, creating bonds that felt unbreakable in the artificial intimacy of dormitory life. Dining hall food was terrible, but eating it felt like an adventure when shared with new friends who laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny. Professor Williams's investigative journalism class changed the trajectory of my academic focus and, ultimately, my life. He was a grizzled veteran of newsrooms and war zones, with scars both visible and hidden from decades of chasing truth in dangerous places. His first assignment seemed simple: find a story on campus that others had overlooked. I spent weeks wandering through academic buildings and talking to maintenance workers, slowly uncovering a pattern of wage theft that affected dozens of employees. The administration had systematically underpaid custodial staff for years, counting on their immigration status and language barriers to prevent complaints. My exposé ran on the front page of the student newspaper. Junior year brought internships and the first taste of professional newsrooms, where deadline pressure created an atmosphere of controlled chaos. The Sacramento Bee accepted me as a summer intern, assigning me to cover local government meetings that seemed designed to cure insomnia. City council debates about zoning ordinances and budget allocations taught me that democracy was often boring but always important. My supervisor, Janet Chen, was a distant cousin who'd landed in journalism through her own circuitous route. She'd immigrated from Taiwan as a child and worked twice as hard as her colleagues to prove herself worthy of bylines and respect. "Every story matters to someone," she reminded me. Romance finally found me during my senior year, in the form of David Kim, a philosophy major with intense eyes and strong opinions about everything from Nietzsche to the campus coffee quality. Our first date was a disaster of epic proportions. Rain soaked us during a picnic, and food poisoning from sketchy sushi left us both miserable for days. Yet somehow those shared indignities created a bond stronger than conventional courtship might have achieved. We spent hours in heated debates about ethics and free will, conversations that continued long after the coffee shops closed and the library lights dimmed. His perspective on life challenged my assumptions about journalism and objectivity. Graduation approached with the speed of an oncoming train, bringing anxiety about the real world and adult responsibilities I'd managed to postpone for 4 years. Job interviews became a full-time occupation, each rejection letter a small knife wound to my confidence. The journalism industry was contracting, newspapers closing, or cutting staff with ruthless efficiency. My professors offered encouragement mixed with realism about the challenges facing my chosen profession. "Good journalists will always find work," Professor Williams assured me, but you might not find it where you expect. His words proved prophetic in ways I couldn't imagine, as my career path would twist through territory none of us could foresee. My first real job was at a small weekly newspaper in Fresno, covering everything from high school football to city council meetings to the occasional murder trial. The newsroom consisted of 6 people in a building that smelled like old cigarettes and broken dreams, but it felt like the beginning of something important. My editor, Bill Morrison, was a chain-smoking veteran who'd seen the industry's golden age and its decline, yet still believed in journalism's power to serve democracy. He taught me practical lessons about interviewing reluctant sources and writing headlines that actually got read. The pay was terrible and the hours were long, but every published story felt like a small victory. Weekend visits home became less frequent as my career demanded more time and energy, but family remained my anchor in an increasingly turbulent world. My younger brother Mike had followed a more traditional path into business, and our dinner conversations became friendly debates about the value of profit versus purpose. Mom worried constantly about my irregular schedule and modest paycheck, while Dad expressed pride in my bylines even when he disagreed with my political coverage. Sunday dinners became sacred time, a weekly reminder of who I was before journalism consumed my identity. Grandma, now in her 80s, still made mooncakes and dispensed wisdom with equal generosity. "Success isn't about money," she told me during one visit. David and I maintained our relationship despite the geographic distance and career pressures that tested our commitment. Phone calls and weekend visits kept us connected, though both of us felt the strain of building careers in different cities. His graduate program in philosophy was demanding, and my journalism schedule was unpredictable, creating a relationship conducted primarily through stolen moments and promises of a future when life would be less complicated. We talked about marriage and children with the abstract certainty of people who believe time is infinite and complications are temporary. Our love felt strong enough to weather any storm, though neither of us had experienced the hurricanes that life would eventually send our way. 3 years in Fresno taught me more about human nature than any psychology textbook could have provided. I covered stories of triumph and tragedy, corruption and redemption, learning that truth was often more complex than headlines suggested. The mayor's embezzlement scandal revealed a man struggling with gambling addiction and medical bills, not the cartoonish villain readers expected. A series on homeless veterans uncovered bureaucratic failures that cost lives and dignity, leading to policy changes that actually improved conditions. Each story was a reminder that journalism could make a difference when practiced with skill and compassion. My writing improved through necessity and repetition, finding its rhythm in the weekly deadlines that never paused for inspiration. Career advancement finally came in the form of a job offer from the San Francisco Chronicle, covering state politics from the Capitol in Sacramento. The salary increase was substantial, and the prestige was undeniable, but leaving Fresno felt like abandoning family. My farewell party at the local bar was attended by sources, colleagues, and community members whose stories I'd told over the years. Bill Morrison, my editor and mentor, raised his glass in a toast that brought tears to my eyes. "Sarah's moving on to bigger things," he announced to the crowd, "but she's learned the most important lesson we can teach. Journalism is about serving people, not serving yourself." His words would echo in my mind throughout the challenges ahead. The state capitol was a different world from anything I'd experienced, where policy decisions affected millions of lives and lobbyists wielded influence with surgical precision. My beat included the governor's office, the legislature, and the labyrinthine bureaucracy that actually runs California between elections. Press conferences became theater, with politicians performing for cameras while carefully avoiding substantive answers to difficult questions. Learning to navigate this environment required skills they don't teach in journalism school. Reading between lines, cultivating sources, and maintaining objectivity while witnessing corruption and incompetence on a daily basis. My apartment was a studio near the Capitol building, small but convenient for the odd hours and breaking news that defined political reporting. David visited when he could, but the demands of our respective careers made quality time a luxury we could rarely afford. His dissertation on the ethics of suffering was consuming his days and nights, while my political reporting required attending evening events and weekend conferences that left little room for romance.
We tell emotional and inspiring stories about life's toughest battles, moments of illness, struggle, recovery, love, and loss. Not every story has a happy ending, but each one carries a powerful message of strength, hope, and humanity. Subscribe to discover moving stories that touch the heart and stay with you forever.
We maintained our connection through late-night phone calls and carefully planned visits that felt like brief oases in the desert of our ambitious professional lives. The relationship survived on love and determination, But both of us recognized that something would have to change if we wanted to build a future together, rather than simply maintaining parallel careers in different cities. Marriage seemed like the logical next step, though timing remained a challenge. My investigative series on prison overcrowding won a state journalism award and brought national attention to conditions in California's correctional system. The recognition was personally gratifying, but more important was the policy discussion it generated among lawmakers who had previously ignored the issue. Interviews with former inmates revealed systemic problems that went far beyond simple overcrowding, including medical neglect and abuse that violated basic human dignity. The work required months of research and dozens of interviews with people whose stories were difficult to hear but necessary to tell. David supported my commitment to the project, even when it consumed weekends and vacation days, understanding that some stories demand everything a journalist can give them. Our third year together was marked by growing certainty that we wanted to build a life as partners, not just lovers conducting a long-distance relationship. David finished his dissertation and began looking for teaching positions that would bring him closer to Sacramento, while I considered job opportunities that might offer better work-life balance than the demanding schedule of political reporting required. We were both 28, old enough to understand what we wanted, but young enough to believe that careful planning could guarantee the future we envisioned together. Marriage proposals and wedding plans occupied our conversations with increasing frequency, though neither of us had quite worked up the courage to take the definitive step that would transform our relationship from serious dating into lifelong commitment. The proposal finally came during a weekend camping trip to Yosemite, with Half Dome providing a backdrop that made any photographer weep with envy. David had planned the moment with characteristic attention to detail, hiking us to a secluded overlook where the valley spread below like a living postcard. His hands shook as he dropped to one knee, the ring catching sunlight that seemed arranged specifically for this moment. "Sarah Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the canyon, "you've changed everything about how I see the world." My yes was immediate and absolute, tears mixing with laughter as I tackled him in an embrace that nearly sent us both tumbling down the mountainside. The engagement ring was simple but perfect, chosen with the same care he brought to every important decision. Wedding planning became a battleground between our family's traditions and our own vision for the ceremony. My parents wanted a traditional Chinese banquet with hundreds of guests and enough food to feed a small army. David's Korean family had their own expectations about proper wedding protocols and cultural obligations that couldn't be ignored without offense. We found ourselves mediating between competing sets of grandmothers, each convinced that deviating from ancestral customs would doom our marriage to failure. The compromises we reached satisfied no one completely, but demonstrated our ability to navigate cultural complexity with respect and humor. Our wedding day was a beautiful chaos of languages, traditions, and emotions that somehow wove together into something uniquely ours. The honeymoon in Thailand was our first extended time together without the pressures of work and family obligations. We explored temples and markets, ate street food that made us sick and happy in equal measure, and talked about everything except the practical realities of married life we'd face upon returning home. The tropical heat was oppressive, but something about being completely out of our element created intimacy that our busy lives in California had made difficult to achieve. Long conversations on beach chairs revealed dreams and fears we'd never shared, deepening our understanding of each other in ways that years of dating hadn't accomplished. Photography became our shared obsession, documenting every sunset and temple visit as if we could preserve the happiness forever. Returning to Sacramento brought immediate challenges that tested our newlywed bliss in ways neither of us had anticipated. David's job search was frustrating, with philosophy PhDs proving less marketable than either of us had expected. My career was demanding longer hours and more travel as political campaigns heated up for the upcoming gubernatorial race. We'd imagined domestic life as endless dinners together and weekend adventures, not the reality of conflicting schedules and financial stress that actually greeted us. Our tiny apartment felt even smaller with two people's belongings competing for limited space, and minor irritations began to feel like major incompatibilities. Love remained strong, but the daily grind of marriage proved more challenging than either of us had anticipated. David finally found work teaching at a community college, a position that utilized his education while paying enough to reduce our financial anxiety. His students were older and more diverse than typical university undergraduates, bringing life experiences that enriched classroom discussions about ethics and meaning. He came home energized by teaching in ways that graduate school had never provided, sharing stories of students who were discovering philosophy for the first time. My reporting continued to focus on state politics, where corruption scandals and budget crises provided endless material for investigation and analysis. We established routines that accommodated our different schedules: morning coffee together, evening walks when possible, and Sunday mornings reserved for lazy conversations in bed. The subject of children began arising more frequently in our conversations, particularly during visits with friends who were starting families of their own. My biological clock wasn't exactly alarming, but at 28, motherhood felt like a decision that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. David expressed enthusiasm about fatherhood, tempered by practical concerns about timing and finances that reflected his philosophical training in examining all angles of complex decisions. We agreed to start trying after my 30th birthday, giving us 2 more years to stabilize our careers and save money for the lifestyle changes that children would inevitably bring. The timeline felt reasonable and responsible, though life would later prove how little control we actually had over such fundamental decisions. Our first home purchase was a small house in a neighborhood that balanced affordability with proximity to both our jobs, a compromise that required careful budgeting but felt like a significant milestone in our adult lives together. The mortgage payments stretched our finances thin, but having our own space transformed our marriage in ways we hadn't expected. David converted the spare bedroom into a home office where he could grade papers and work on his writing, while I established a corner of the living room as my workspace for freelance articles that supplemented my newspaper salary. Weekend projects included painting walls, planting a garden, and learning to fix household problems that had previously been someone else's responsibility. The house wasn't perfect, but it was ours. My 30th birthday marked not just another year, but the beginning of our active attempts to start a family, a transition that transformed our intimate life from spontaneous pleasure into carefully planned conception efforts. Ovulation calendars and fertility tracking apps replaced romantic spontaneity with clinical precision that felt both necessary and somehow antiseptic. David approached the process with his characteristic thoughtfulness, reading books about male fertility and adjusting his diet and exercise routine to optimize our chances of success. I found myself paying attention to my body in new ways, monitoring symptoms and cycles with the intensity one usually reserved for investigative reporting. The focus on conception made sex feel like homework rather than lovemaking, though we tried to maintain humor about the situation. The positive pregnancy test appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 pink lines that changed everything in an instant. David was brushing his teeth when I burst into the bathroom, test in hand and tears streaming down my face in joy and terror. His reaction was pure elation, spinning me around despite my protests about morning sickness that had already begun making itself known. We called our parents that evening, sharing news that generated squeals of excitement from our mothers and gruff congratulations from our fathers, who were clearly emotional despite their attempts at masculine restraint. The pregnancy felt like validation of our life together, proof that we'd built something stable enough to expand beyond ourselves. Morning sickness was brutal, but we embraced even the miserable symptoms. The first trimester was a blur of doctor's appointments, prenatal vitamins, and cautious optimism about the future we were creating together. David read pregnancy books with the same intensity he'd once applied to Kant and Heidegger, taking notes and asking questions that made our obstetrician smile with recognition of first-time parent anxiety. We started looking at cribs and car seats, planning for a nursery that would transform our spare room into the center of our expanding universe. My reporting became more challenging as fatigue and nausea affected my ability to work long hours, but my editors were understanding about the temporary limitations that pregnancy imposed. The ultrasound at 8 weeks revealed a tiny heartbeat that made everything feel suddenly, miraculously real. The bleeding started on a Thursday morning at 10 weeks, light at first but persistent enough to worry us both. David drove me to the emergency room with the kind of calm focus he always displayed in crises, holding my hand while we waited for doctors who moved with practiced efficiency through examinations that would determine our baby's fate. The ultrasound technician's silence spoke louder than words, her professional composure unable to hide the absence of the heartbeat that had been so strong just weeks earlier. "I'm sorry," the doctor said finally, his words landing like physical blows that knocked the breath from our lungs. The miscarriage was complete, our baby gone in a way that made no sense and offered no comfort beyond cold statistics. The grief that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced, a physical pain that made eating and sleeping feel like insurmountable challenges. David held me through nights when crying felt like the only thing my body knew how to do, his own tears mixing with mine in a shared sorrow that somehow made the loss both more bearable and more acute. Friends offered condolences that felt inadequate, well-meaning words that couldn't bridge the gap between their sympathy and our actual experience of losing a child we'd already begun to love. Work became my refuge, long hours at the office providing distraction from the empty nursery we'd planned and the future that suddenly felt uncertain rather than inevitable. Therapy helped, but healing was a slow process that couldn't be rushed. 6 months later, we decided to try again. approaching pregnancy with hope tempered by experience of how quickly joy could turn to heartbreak. The second positive test brought excitement mixed with anxiety that hadn't existed the first time, when innocence had protected us from knowledge of how much we had to lose. This pregnancy proceeded more smoothly initially. Each milestone passed with cautious celebration rather than the unqualified happiness we'd felt before. David was more protective, insisting I reduce my workload and avoid the stress that had become routine in political reporting. We delayed announcing the pregnancy until after the first trimester, sharing our news with family and close friends who understood why our joy was measured rather than exuberant. The second miscarriage came at 12 weeks, another Thursday morning that began with bleeding and ended with the same doctor delivering the same devastating news. This loss felt worse somehow, as if the first pregnancy had used up our quota of naive hope and left us vulnerable to despair we couldn't postpone through ignorance. The grief was familiar now, but no less overwhelming, complicated by anger at the unfairness of losing 2 babies while friends announced successful pregnancies with casual confidence. David suggested we take a break from trying, give ourselves time to heal before risking another loss that might break something in us that couldn't be repaired. The decision felt like giving up and self-preservation simultaneously, a choice that revealed how profoundly the losses had changed our relationship to hope. Medical testing revealed no obvious cause for our pregnancy losses, a diagnosis of unexplained recurrent miscarriage that offered no solutions and little comfort. Fertility specialists recommended various treatments and procedures, each more invasive and expensive than the last, promising improved odds but no guarantees of success. The process transformed conception from an act of love into a carefully monitored medical procedure involving hormones, injections, and scheduled intimacy that felt clinical rather than romantic. Insurance coverage was limited, forcing us to drain our savings for treatments that might or might not work. Friends and family offered advice ranging from helpful to ridiculous, everyone becoming an expert on fertility based on stories they'd heard or articles they'd read online. The decision to pursue adoption came gradually, emerging from conversations that stretched over months as we investigated different agencies and programs that might help us become parents through alternative means. The application process was invasive and expensive, requiring financial records, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations that stripped away privacy in ways that natural conception never demanded. Home studies involved social workers examining our marriage, our finances, and our motivations for parenthood with scrutiny that felt both necessary and intrusive. David approached the process with characteristic thoroughness, researching statistics and success rates while I focused on the emotional preparation for loving a child who wouldn't share our genetic material but would hopefully share our lives. The waiting period stretched indefinitely, measured not in months but in phone calls that might bring news of a baby available for placement with parents desperate enough to navigate bureaucratic complexity for the chance to love someone else's child. We attended support groups for prospective adoptive parents, sharing our story with couples who'd traveled similar paths of infertility and loss before arriving at the same conclusion about building families through adoption rather than conception. The stories were remarkably similar. Years of trying, multiple miscarriages, expensive treatments that failed to produce viable pregnancies, and finally the decision to pursue parenthood through different means. The waiting was the hardest part, knowing that somewhere a birth mother was making decisions that would determine our future. Our first adoption match fell through when the birth mother changed her mind during her final trimester, a decision that was legally her right but emotionally devastating for us after months of preparing for a specific baby we'd already begun to love. The nursery we'd finally allowed ourselves to set up became a painful reminder of hopes that had been raised and dashed again, though this time by human choice rather than biological failure. David took the news with philosophical resignation, but I found myself angry in ways that surprised me with their intensity. We'd followed all the rules, completed all the paperwork, and proven our worthiness as parents, yet we were still childless while the birth mother retained the power to change her mind at any moment until the adoption was legally finalized. 6 months later, we were matched with another expectant mother, a college student who'd chosen us from agency profiles that reduced our lives to photographs and carefully crafted descriptions of our readiness for parenthood. This time we approached the situation with more caution, protecting ourselves emotionally while still preparing practically for the possibility of bringing home a baby. The birth mother, Jennifer, was studying nursing and had decided that raising a child would prevent her from completing her education and building the career she'd worked toward since high school. Our conversations with her were limited but meaningful, establishing a connection that felt respectful of her difficult situation while acknowledging our desperate hope for the child she was carrying. Emma was born on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 pounds and 12 ounces of perfect baby girl who came into the world with strong lungs and an attitude that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted from life. Jennifer held her first, a moment we witnessed from across the hospital room with a mixture of joy and anxiety about whether this placement would actually proceed to finalization. When Jennifer nodded toward us, indicating it was time for us to meet our daughter, David and I approached with trembling hands and hearts full of emotions we couldn't have named if our lives depended on it. Holding Emma for the first time felt like a miracle and a responsibility that overwhelmed us both, her tiny fingers wrapping around mine with trust that would become the foundation of our family. The legal process moved forward over the following months, with Jennifer maintaining her decision to place Emma with us despite family pressure to reconsider and raise the baby herself. We respected her privacy during this period, knowing that too much contact might complicate her emotional process while too little might make us seem ungrateful for the incredible gift she was giving us. Emma thrived in our care, reaching developmental milestones that filled us with the pride and anxiety that all new parents experience regardless of whether their children are biological or adopted. Sleep deprivation became our new normal, but it felt like a privilege after years of sleeping through quiet nights that had stretched endlessly without the sounds of a baby who needed us. The finalization hearing was held in a courtroom that felt too formal for the intimate process of legally creating a family, but the judge's words made Emma officially ours in ways that biology had failed to accomplish. David cried during the ceremony, his philosophical composure finally breaking under the weight of joy that felt too large for his usually controlled emotional expression. Emma was walking by then, toddling around the courtroom in a way that made even the stern judge smile as she declared our adoption complete and binding. Family photographs taken that day captured the relief and happiness of people who'd traveled a difficult road to reach a destination they'd almost stopped believing they could find. Our parents flew in for the ceremony, grandparents finally getting the chance to spoil a grandchild they'd worried might never exist in our lives. Parenthood transformed our daily routines in ways that felt both overwhelming and completely natural, as if we'd been preparing for Emma's needs without realizing it through all the years of trying to conceive. Sleep schedules became irrelevant. Meal planning revolved around baby food and organic snacks, and conversations about complex political issues gave way to discussions of teething and developmental milestones. David proved to be an intuitive father, reading bedtime stories with different voices for each character, and teaching Emma to walk by holding her hands while she took unsteady steps across our living room. My reporting schedule became more predictable as I chose assignments that didn't require extensive travel or overnight stays, prioritizing presence over prestige in ways that surprised colleagues who'd known me as intensely career-focused. The balance between work and family required constant adjustment, but having Emma made choices that had once seemed impossible feel obvious and necessary. My editor at the Sacramento paper was understanding about my reduced availability for breaking news and last-minute assignments, though I maintained my commitment to longer investigative pieces that could be researched and written around Emma's schedule. David's teaching load provided flexibility that allowed him to be home with Emma during the day while I worked, creating a tag-team approach to childcare that maximized our time with her while maintaining our professional responsibilities. Friends marveled at how natural we seemed as parents, not knowing about the years of preparation and longing that had preceded Emma's arrival in our lives. Emma's first birthday was celebrated with a party in our backyard, attended by neighbors and colleagues who'd watched us struggle through infertility and adoption uncertainty before finally achieving the family we'd worked so hard to create. She wore a yellow dress that made her look like sunshine itself, laughing with pure joy as she opened presents and smeared cake frosting across her face with the enthusiasm that only toddlers can muster. David and I exchanged glances throughout the party, silently acknowledging how far we'd traveled from the desperate couple who'd once wondered if we'd ever have reason to buy birthday decorations or plan children's parties. The photographs from that day would later remind me of a happiness so complete it seemed impossible that anything could threaten it, though life would soon prove how quickly joy could be replaced by terror. Career opportunities continued to present themselves despite my reduced availability for travel and breaking news coverage, with my investigative reporting on state government earning recognition that opened doors to national publications and television appearances. The work felt more meaningful now that I had Emma to consider, knowing that the policies I covered would affect her future in ways that made abstract political debates feel personally urgent. David's philosophical writings began incorporating his experiences of fatherhood, exploring questions about responsibility, love, and the meaning of legacy that had become personally relevant rather than purely academic. We were both growing in our professions while growing as people, changed by parenthood in ways that made us better at everything we did. The decision to have Emma evaluated by a child psychologist came after observing her exceptional verbal development and social awareness that seemed advanced for her age, though we wanted professional confirmation that we weren't just typical parents who thought their child was gifted. Dr. Sarah Martinez confirmed that Emma was indeed intellectually precocious, scoring in the 99th percentile on developmental assessments while displaying emotional intelligence that suggested she might benefit from enrichment activities designed for gifted children. The evaluation was reassuring and slightly overwhelming, as we realized that parenting a gifted child would require different strategies and considerations than we'd anticipated when we first dreamed of having a family. Emma's second birthday approached with anticipation that felt genuine rather than forced, as our family had settled into rhythms that accommodated everyone's needs while maintaining the spontaneity that made daily life enjoyable rather than merely functional. Planning the party required considerations about her friends from daycare and our adult friends who'd become honorary aunts and uncles in Emma's expanding social world. The celebration would be larger than her first birthday, reflecting both her growing personality and our increasing confidence as parents who'd moved beyond the anxiety of new adoption into the simple joy of raising a remarkable child who brought light into every room she entered. The guest list included Jennifer, Emma's birth mother, who maintained a relationship with our family that honored the complexity of adoption. The morning of Emma's second birthday party dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the backyard celebration we'd planned with bouncy houses and face painting that would entertain children and adults alike. Emma woke early, excited about the party in the way that 2-year-olds approach special events with pure anticipation, untainted by adult worries about logistics and timing. David was setting up decorations while I prepared food and tried to manage Emma's excitement level so she wouldn't be completely exhausted by the time guests arrived. The phone call from my editor came at 9 a.m, requesting immediate coverage of a breaking story that would require travel to San Francisco for what was expected to be a one-day assignment that would have me back in time for dinner and Emma's bedtime routine. The decision to accept the assignment felt wrong from the moment my editor explained the details, but the story involved corruption allegations against a state senator whose committee work I'd been following for months. Missing this opportunity could mean losing access to sources and information that had taken years to cultivate, potentially compromising future investigations that served the public interest. David encouraged me to go, understanding both my professional obligations and my reluctance to miss any part of Emma's special day. "We'll postpone the big celebration until tomorrow," he suggested, his confidence reassuring as Emma played happily with her birthday toys. The compromise seemed reasonable, allowing me to fulfill my professional duties while ensuring Emma's party would still happen with both parents present. The drive to San Francisco should have been routine, a familiar route I'd traveled hundreds of times during my years covering California politics. Traffic was unusually light for a Saturday morning, and I made excellent time while mentally preparing for interviews and research that would be required for the breaking story about budget negotiations that had collapsed overnight. My phone rang as I approached the Bay Bridge, David's voice cheerful as he reported Emma's successful breakfast and their plans to set up party decorations in my absence. "I love you both," I told him, words that would replay in my mind countless times during the months ahead as I wondered if somehow saying them had been a premonition of disaster. The interviews proceeded smoothly, with sources providing information that confirmed the corruption allegations while revealing additional details that made the story even more significant than my editor had anticipated. By noon, I had enough material for a comprehensive exposé that would require careful writing to ensure accuracy while protecting sources who'd risked their careers to speak truth about abuse of power. The drive back to Sacramento began at 2 p.m, plenty of time to reach home before Emma's bedtime and help David clean up after the birthday celebration that would have concluded by the time I arrived. My phone showed missed calls from David, but I assumed he was updating me about party activities rather than calling with urgent news. The intersection where my life would divide into before and after appeared ahead with no warning of the catastrophe waiting in cross traffic. I was singing along to music on the radio, thinking about Emma's excited face when I would arrive home with the birthday present I'd picked up in San Francisco, a stuffed animal that matched one she'd seen in a bookstore window the previous week. The light was green as I entered the intersection, my attention focused on the road ahead rather than the 18-wheeler running the red light at fatal speed from my right side. The impact came with violence that compressed time and space into a single moment of crushing metal and shattering glass, followed by darkness that swallowed everything whole. Consciousness returned in fragments over the following days. Brief moments of awareness, punctuated by medicated oblivion that protected me from fully comprehending what had happened to my body and my life. The first clear memory was David's face beside my hospital bed, his eyes red with tears and exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights spent wondering if I would survive the massive trauma that had nearly killed me. "Emma?" was the first word I managed to speak, my throat raw from intubation and my voice barely recognizable as my own. "She's fine," David whispered, his hand gripping mine with desperate intensity. "She's with your parents, and she's fine. You need to focus on getting better now." Dr. Martinez delivered the devastating news with professional compassion that couldn't soften the brutal reality of spinal cord damage that had severed my connection to everything below my chest. The 18-wheeler had struck my sedan with such force that the impact compressed 3 vertebrae and damaged my spinal cord beyond surgical repair, leaving me permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Physical therapy would help me adapt to life in a wheelchair, but sensation and movement in my legs were gone forever, along with the independence I'd always taken for granted. The words hit me harder than the truck had. Each medical term another nail in the coffin of the life I'd known before that intersection changed everything. The ceiling tiles became my constant companions during the weeks that followed, their pattern memorized during endless hours when sleep wouldn't come and consciousness brought only the reality of a body that no longer obeyed my commands. Physical therapists moved my lifeless legs through range of motion exercises, explaining the importance of preventing muscle atrophy and blood clots, while I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future that seemed impossible to contemplate. Other patients in the rehabilitation ward shared stories of their own accidents and recoveries, some maintaining optimism that inspired me while others had clearly accepted limitations that I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. The variety of human responses to catastrophic injury was both heartening and terrifying. Emma's 3rd birthday passed while I was still in the hospital, a milestone I observed through video calls that couldn't disguise the strain on her face when she looked at mommy in the hospital bed surrounded by machines and tubes. David had tried to maintain normalcy, hosting a small party with family members who spoke in cheerful voices that couldn't hide their worry about my condition and our family's future. Emma opened presents with less enthusiasm than usual, frequently looking toward the phone screen where I watched from my hospital bed, unable to participate in the celebration except as a distant observer of my daughter's special day. The guilt of missing another important moment in her life added emotional pain to the physical agony that had become my constant companion. Legal proceedings began while I was still learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair, attorneys explaining insurance policies and liability issues that would determine our financial future, while I struggled with basic tasks like brushing my teeth and getting dressed without assistance. The truck driver who'd hit me carried minimal insurance, and his company's lawyers argued that mechanical failure rather than driver error had caused the accident that destroyed my body and our carefully planned life. Depositions would be required once I was sufficiently recovered to withstand the emotional stress of reliving the accident in legal testimony that would be scrutinized by opposing counsel looking for ways to minimize their client's responsibility. The intersection of medicine and law created a bureaucratic nightmare that David navigated, while I focused on the exhausting work of relearning how to exist in a body that no longer functioned as it had for 34 years. The transition home after 3 months in the hospital was harder than anyone had prepared us for, including the social workers who'd explained accessibility modifications with clinical detachment that couldn't capture the emotional reality of needing a ramp to enter my own front door. Our house required extensive renovations to accommodate my wheelchair and the medical equipment that had become permanent fixtures in our lives, changes that David had coordinated while managing Emma's care and his own job responsibilities. The bathroom had been completely rebuilt with roll-in shower and grab bars, while doorways were widened and threshold ramps installed throughout the house. The modifications were functional but served as daily reminders of how dramatically our lives had changed in ways we could never have anticipated. Emma's reaction to my homecoming was a mixture of joy and confusion, her 3-year-old mind struggling to understand why mommy was now in a wheelchair and needed help with tasks she'd previously managed independently. Her adaptation was remarkably fast, treating my wheelchair as simply another piece of furniture and climbing into my lap for stories as if nothing significant had changed about our relationship. Her acceptance was complete and uncomplicated, a gift that shamed me for the self-pity that consumed too many of my waking hours when I should have been grateful for survival and the opportunity to continue being her mother, albeit in different ways than I'd originally planned. David had transformed into someone I barely recognized, managing my medical care, Emma's daily needs, and his own career with efficiency that spoke to reserves of strength I'd never suspected he possessed. Physical therapy continued 3 times a week at an outpatient clinic where other patients struggled with their own versions of physical limitation and frustrated hope. Some had been injured more recently than me and still believed full recovery was possible with enough effort and determination. Others were years into their rehabilitation journeys, having learned to find meaning in small improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs that medical science couldn't deliver. My therapist, Maria Santos, was a woman whose own spinal cord injury 15 years earlier had taught her both the technical skills and emotional wisdom needed to guide patients through the stages of grief and acceptance that followed catastrophic injury. Her presence was both inspiring and intimidating, proof that life could continue after paralysis, but also evidence that the road ahead would be longer and more difficult than I wanted to acknowledge. Career resurrection came gradually through adaptive technology that allowed me to write despite hands that trembled from nerve damage and fatigue that made concentration difficult for more than short periods. Voice recognition software and specialized keyboards became my connection to the professional identity that had defined me before the accident, though the work itself had to adapt to physical limitations that made travel and long hours impossible. My editor at the Sacramento paper offered me a weekly column that could be written from home, focusing on disability rights and healthcare policy with the personal perspective that my situation provided. The work was different from investigative reporting, but no less important, giving voice to experiences that mainstream media often ignored or misunderstood while providing income that helped offset the massive medical expenses that insurance didn't fully cover. 2 years after the accident, I had achieved a level of independence that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of early rehabilitation, though it looked nothing like the life I'd imagined before that intersection changed everything forever. Adaptive driving controls allowed me to operate a specially modified van, returning some measure of mobility that had been lost since the accident destroyed my ability to walk or travel without assistance. Emma had learned to help with tasks that required cooperation between us, her small hands becoming extensions of my limited physical capabilities without either of us thinking consciously about the adaptations that had become routine parts of our daily life. The relationship between mother and daughter had deepened in unexpected ways, our bond strengthened by challenges that might have weakened families less committed to making adaptation work for everyone involved. David had returned to full-time work at his community college, confident that I could manage most situations independently with the emergency systems and support networks we'd carefully constructed around potential complications. His transformation from philosophy professor to primary caregiver and back to educator had been remarkable to witness, revealing depths of practical capability and emotional resilience that his academic background hadn't prepared anyone to expect. Our marriage had survived the stress test that serious injury imposed on relationships, emerging different but not weaker than it had been before trauma forced us to re-examine every assumption about partnership, love, and the promises we'd made to each other during healthier times when such vows seemed purely theoretical rather than daily practice. Emma's 4th birthday was celebrated with a party that accommodated my wheelchair and energy limitations while maintaining the joy and excitement that such milestones deserved in any child's life. Planning required considerations I'd never thought about before the accident, ensuring wheelchair accessibility and managing my own fatigue in ways that wouldn't dampen her enthusiasm for celebration. The party was attended by close friends who'd remained loyal through the difficult months when many others had gradually disappeared from our lives, unable to handle the discomfort of confronting what serious injury had done to people they'd known as healthy and independent. Emma wore the princess dress she'd requested, spinning in circles that made the skirt flare while I watched from my wheelchair with love that felt both infinite and inadequate to protect her from future pain. Professional recognition came unexpectedly in the form of a journalism award for my column series on healthcare accessibility, an honor that felt both validating and strange given how dramatically my career path had changed since the accident transformed me from political reporter to disability advocate. The ceremony would be held in Los Angeles, requiring travel arrangements and accommodations that healthy people never considered but that had become routine parts of any journey I undertook beyond our local area. David and Emma accompanied me, turning the trip into a family vacation that combined professional obligations with visits to museums and beaches that offered wheelchair-accessible facilities. The recognition was meaningful, but more important was the platform it provided for continuing to tell stories that needed to be told about experiences most people preferred to ignore. Marriage counseling became necessary as David and I struggled to redefine our relationship around circumstances neither of us had chosen or prepared for adequately despite years of believing our love could survive anything life might throw at us. The accident had changed our roles dramatically, transforming David from equal partner to primary caregiver, while reducing me from independent professional to someone who needed assistance with basic daily tasks that I'd previously managed without thought. Resentment built gradually on both sides, my frustration with dependence matching his exhaustion from carrying responsibilities that had once been shared equally between us. Our counselor helped us articulate feelings that had seemed too dangerous to express directly, creating space for honesty that strengthened rather than threatened our commitment to each other and to Emma. The decision to have Emma evaluated by a child psychologist came after months of observing behavioral changes that suggested she was struggling more than her cheerful demeanor indicated during our daily interactions. Night terrors had become frequent, and she developed anxieties about separation that made simple errands complicated when she refused to let David leave her with babysitters she'd previously trusted without question. Dr. Jennifer Martinez specialized in helping children process family trauma, using play therapy and age-appropriate conversations to help Emma understand and express feelings about her mother's changed condition and capabilities that she couldn't articulate on her own. The sessions revealed that Emma blamed herself for the accident, believing that her birthday party demands had somehow caused me to drive dangerously on the way to work that morning. Adaptive technology became my gateway to professional resurrection and personal independence, voice recognition software, and specialized equipment, allowing me to work despite physical limitations that might have ended my career in earlier decades. Writing became more challenging due to fatigue and concentration difficulties that resulted from the massive trauma my body had endured, but the actual mechanics of putting words on paper were manageable with the right tools and techniques. My column reached audiences who saw themselves reflected in narratives of struggle and adaptation, readers who'd felt invisible in mainstream media coverage that treated disability as inspiration porn or personal tragedy, rather than simply another way of being human in a world designed primarily for people without physical limitations. The work provided both income and purpose, two necessities that had seemed uncertain during the early months of recovery. Financial security came through a legal settlement that was less than our attorneys had hoped for, but sufficient to ensure access to medical care and adaptive equipment that would allow some version of independent living in the years ahead. The truck driver's insurance was minimal, and his company's lawyers had fought every aspect of the claim with ruthless efficiency that prolonged the legal process for over 2 years. The settlement couldn't restore sensation to my legs or return us to the life we'd lost, but it could purchase the tools needed to build something new from the wreckage of our former dreams and expectations. Medical expenses would continue for the rest of my life, but at least we wouldn't have to choose between necessary equipment and Emma's education or other family priorities that remained important despite our changed circumstances. Emma's adjustment to having a mother with a disability was remarkably successful, though it required ongoing attention from all of us to ensure that she didn't take on inappropriate responsibilities or develop anxieties about my safety that interfered with her normal childhood development. Child psychology sessions helped her understand that accidents happen without anyone being at fault, especially not little girls who simply wanted birthday parties and time with their parents. Her resilience was inspiring and humbling, revealing reserves of adaptability that adults often underestimate in children who are given appropriate support and honest communication about difficult situations. She learned to see my wheelchair not as a symbol of limitation, but as simply another way her mother moved through the world, no more significant than hair color or shoe size in her understanding of what made people who they are. 3 years post-accident, our family had developed routines and adaptations that accommodated everyone's needs while maintaining the spontaneity and joy that made daily life enjoyable rather than merely functional. Emma was now 6 years old, attending school and participating in activities that brought normal childhood experiences into our household while exposing her to other families dealing with various challenges and circumstances. David's work had evolved to include writing about the philosophy of suffering and resilience, drawing on our practical experience to inform academic discussions that benefited from real-world perspective rather than purely theoretical analysis. My own writing continued to focus on disability rights and healthcare policy, using whatever influence I'd gained to advocate for changes that would improve lives for people whose stories rarely reached public attention or policy consideration. The phone call from Dr. Martinez came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working on a column about accessibility in public transportation, Emma playing quietly nearby with toys that had become familiar companions during my writing time at home. "Sarah, we need to discuss Emma's latest psychological evaluation," she began, her tone carrying the professional gravity that preceded difficult news in my experience with medical professionals. The assessment had revealed developmental delays and behavioral patterns suggesting that her early trauma from my accident had affected her more profoundly than previous evaluations had detected or anyone in our family had recognized despite our careful attention to her emotional well-being. Regression in language development and social skills would require additional therapy and possibly medication to address anxiety that was interfering with her ability to form relationships with peers at school. The news felt like another loss in a series of losses that had defined our family's experience since the accident, though Dr. Martinez emphasized that with proper treatment, most children recovered fully from trauma-related developmental issues that emerged years after the original incident. Emma looked up from her toys as I ended the call, her expression curious about the conversation she couldn't understand, but somehow sensing its importance to our family's ongoing struggle to heal from wounds that weren't always visible or obvious to outside observers. The realization that my accident had damaged not just my own body, but potentially Emma's development, added guilt to the complex mixture of emotions that had accompanied my recovery process from the beginning. Professional help would be available, but the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into an uncertain future filled with challenges I hadn't anticipated when I'd first believed that surviving the accident was the hardest part of this journey. Legal proceedings finally concluded with a settlement that provided financial security, while leaving emotional questions about justice and responsibility largely unresolved in ways that I'd been warned to expect from the beginning. The truck driver received a traffic citation and a small fine, penalties that seemed inadequate given the magnitude of consequences his actions had imposed on our family and my personal future. His insurance company paid the settlement without admitting fault, a standard legal arrangement that protected them from future liability while providing us with resources needed for ongoing medical care and adaptive equipment. The money couldn't restore what we'd lost, but it could purchase tools needed for building a different kind of life than we'd originally planned during those earlier years when we'd believed that careful preparation could protect us from random catastrophe. Community support had been crucial during the most difficult periods of adjustment, with neighbors, colleagues, and even strangers contributing time, resources, and emotional support that made survival possible when our own strength wasn't sufficient for the challenges we face daily. Disability rights organizations provided practical guidance and emotional support from people who understood the complex process of adapting to life with permanent physical limitations. Online communities connected me with other writers and advocates who'd found ways to continue meaningful work despite disabilities that might have ended their careers in previous generations when adaptive technology wasn't available. The web of connection that sustained me during recovery continued to provide meaning and purpose that made each day worth living despite physical limitations that would never completely disappear from my daily experience. 5 years have passed since that morning when an 18-wheeler ran a red light and altered the trajectory of my life in ways I'm still discovering with each new challenge and adaptation that emerges from living with permanent disability. Emma is now 8 years old, a resilient child whose early trauma has resolved into normal development thanks to therapy, time, and the love that surrounded her during the darkest period of our family's journey through crisis and recovery. She's learned to see my wheelchair not as a symbol of limitation, but as simply another way her mother moves through the world, no more significant than hair color or shoe size in her understanding of what makes people who they are as individuals deserving of respect and consideration. Her acceptance has been complete and uncomplicated, a gift that continues to shame me for the self-pity that still consumes too many of my waking hours. David has returned to teaching full-time while maintaining his role as primary caregiver for both Emma and me, finding renewed purpose in helping students grapple with questions about suffering, meaning, and human resilience that he now approaches from hard-won experience rather than abstract philosophical theory. His academic writing has evolved to include practical applications of philosophical concepts to real-world challenges like disability, trauma, and family adaptation, contributing to scholarly discussions that benefit from lived experience rather than purely theoretical speculation. Our marriage survived the test that serious injury imposed on our relationship, emerging not unscathed but somehow stronger for having weathered a storm that destroys many partnerships less firmly rooted in genuine commitment and mutual respect that extends beyond physical capability or independence. The question that everyone wants answered, the one that draws people to stories like mine, is whether I consider myself lucky or unlucky, blessed or cursed by the accident that took my legs but left me alive to tell this tale of survival and adaptation. The answer is more complex than most people expect, containing contradictions that resist simple categorization into triumph or tragedy, inspiration or cautionary tale about the fragility of human plans and expectations. I lost the ability to walk, to feel my legs, to live without constant awareness of physical limitations that healthy people navigate unconsciously throughout their daily lives. But I gained perspectives on human resilience, community support, and the arbitrary nature of suffering that have enriched my understanding of what it means to be fully human in ways that my previous able-bodied existence never provided or made possible. The accident revealed reserves of strength in David, Emma, and myself that might have remained dormant if we'd never been forced to discover them through necessity rather than choice, through crisis rather than curiosity about our own capabilities. David's transformation from abstract philosopher to practical caregiver demonstrated depths of love and commitment that neither of us had fully understood despite years of marriage and shared challenges like infertility and adoption. Emma's adaptability and acceptance taught all of us lessons about unconditional love and the resilience of children when they're supported by adults who prioritize their emotional well-being over their own comfort or convenience. My own journey from despair to acceptance to advocacy revealed capacity for reinvention that I'd never suspected I possessed during my earlier life when identity seemed fixed rather than fluid and adaptable to changing circumstances. My career has evolved into something I couldn't have imagined before the accident, focusing on disability rights and healthcare policy with the authority that comes from personal experience rather than journalistic observation or academic study. The stories I tell now reach audiences who see themselves reflected in narratives of struggle and adaptation, readers who felt invisible in mainstream media coverage that treats disability as inspiration porn or personal tragedy, rather than simply another way of being human in a diverse world. Awards and professional recognition feel less important than emails from readers who found hope or practical guidance in columns written from my kitchen table between Emma's school pickup and David's evening return from work. The platform that tragedy provided has become a responsibility I take seriously, using whatever influence I've gained to advocate for changes that improve lives for people whose stories rarely reach public attention or policy consideration. The lawsuit settlement, combined with disability insurance and my continuing freelance income, provides financial security that allows focus on writing and advocacy rather than basic survival concerns that consume many families dealing with serious injury or chronic illness without adequate resources or support systems. We live comfortably in our adapted home, with equipment and support services that make independence possible in ways that weren't available to previous generations of people with spinal cord injuries who faced much greater limitations and isolation. Emma attends an excellent school where teachers understand that children from families dealing with medical challenges sometimes need extra patience and flexibility, though she's thrived academically and socially despite the disruptions her early years contained. David has published articles connecting his philosophical training with our practical experience of trauma and recovery, contributing to academic discussions about suffering and meaning that benefit from his unique perspective as both scholar and caregiver. The physical reality of paralysis hasn't changed since the accident, and probably never will despite advances in spinal cord research that offer hope to people injured more recently than me but remain largely experimental for someone with my specific type and extent of injury. I wake each morning to legs that won't move and sensations that will never return, transferring from bed to wheelchair with movements that have become automatic through years of repetition and practice. Pain management remains a daily challenge, with phantom sensations and chronic discomfort that require careful balancing of medication and activity levels to maintain functionality without losing mental clarity or emotional stability. Some days are better than others, a reality that anyone with chronic health conditions understands intuitively, but that healthy people often struggle to comprehend when they encounter disability in their daily lives and interactions. Acceptance doesn't mean giving up hope for improvement or adaptation, but it does mean building a meaningful life within current limitations rather than postponing happiness until circumstances change in ways that may never occur despite medical advances or technological innovations. The broader implications of my story extend beyond personal triumph over adversity to questions about how society treats its most vulnerable members and whether we've created systems that support human dignity regardless of physical capability or economic productivity. Healthcare policy debates that once felt abstract now carry personal weight, as I've experienced firsthand the bureaucratic obstacles that prevent people from accessing equipment and services they need to live independently and contribute meaningfully to their communities. Insurance companies still view wheelchairs and home modifications as luxuries rather than necessities, forcing families to fight battles that drain emotional and financial resources during periods when they're least equipped to handle additional stress or advocacy responsibilities. Advocacy has become both professional duty and personal mission, using whatever platform my story provides to highlight systemic problems that affect millions of people whose voices rarely reach policymakers or public attention in meaningful ways. The lessons I've learned from Dancing with Death and Emerging Changed but Alive are difficult to summarize without sounding like greeting card sentiment or therapeutic platitudes that minimize the genuine complexity of adapting to catastrophic change. Life is fragile and precious, but also resilient and surprising in its capacity to generate meaning from circumstances that initially seem purely destructive or meaningless. Love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing, though it also requires more conscious effort when expressed through adapted means rather than conventional gestures that able-bodied people take for granted. Suffering is universal but not uniformly distributed, creating obligations for those who've survived their own trials to support others who are still struggling to find their footing after life-altering events. Community matters more than individual achievement, though independence remains valuable when balanced with appropriate acceptance of help from people who care enough to offer it consistently over time, rather than just during crisis periods when need is most obvious. The most profound realization that has emerged from 5 years of living with paralysis is that happiness doesn't require the absence of difficulty or the fulfillment of every dream we once held dear during healthier times when the future seemed controllable through careful planning and hard work. Emma's laughter still fills our home with joy that transcends any physical limitations I experience, her childhood unfolding with the same mixture of wonder and occasional frustration that characterizes healthy development regardless of family circumstances or challenges. David's love has deepened rather than diminished through the trials we've faced together, though it now expresses itself through actions like helping with transfers and managing medical appointments that weren't part of our original marriage vows or romantic expectations. The family we've built together bears little resemblance to the one we planned during those early years when we believed we could control outcomes through careful preparation and strong intentions, but it's no less precious for being different from our original vision or societal expectations about what constitutes a successful family unit. The accident that nearly killed me 5 years ago also revealed truths about human resilience and community support that might have remained hidden if trauma hadn't forced their discovery through necessity rather than choice. I survived not through individual strength alone, but because of medical professionals who worked tirelessly to save my life, family members who rearranged their own priorities to provide care and support, and friends who remained present through months when I had little to offer in return for their loyalty and consistency. The web of connection that sustained me during the darkest period of recovery continues to provide meaning and purpose that makes each day worth living despite physical limitations that will never completely disappear from my daily experience. If I could speak to the Sarah who woke up in that hospital bed 5 years ago, facing the devastation of paralysis and the collapse of every plan she'd made for her future, I would tell her that survival is possible even when it seems impossible, that love persists even when its expression must change, and that meaning can emerge from chaos if you're patient enough to wait for it to reveal itself through time and experience rather than demanding immediate understanding. The road ahead would be harder than anything she could imagine during those early days when hope and despair alternated like weather systems, but also more rewarding in ways that her able-bodied experience hadn't prepared her to recognize or appreciate fully. The accident would take her legs but give her a story worth telling, a platform for advocacy that could improve other lives, and a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be human in a world that tests everyone's capacity for endurance, adaptation, and grace under pressure. Most importantly, I would tell her that the love waiting at home would prove stronger than any tragedy that tried to destroy it, and that Emma would grow up knowing her mother as someone who faced impossible circumstances with courage and determination, rather than as someone defined by what she'd lost rather than what she'd found in the wreckage of her former life. The intersection where my old life ended and this new one began remains a daily presence in my thoughts, not as a source of bitterness or regret, but as a reminder that every moment contains the possibility of profound change that we can neither predict nor prevent through careful planning or cautious living. I drive past it sometimes, when medical appointments or family errands require travel through that part of Sacramento, and I always slow down slightly as I approach the traffic light that has been repaired and now functions properly, a small monument to the randomness of fate and the resilience of human beings who refuse to be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. The 18-wheeler and its driver are long gone, moved on to other routes and other loads, their brief intersection with my life creating consequences they'll never fully understand or appreciate. But the lesson remains carved into asphalt and memory. Life is precious precisely because it's fragile. Love matters most when it's tested by circumstances beyond our control, and every day we're given is a gift that deserves our full attention regardless of the package in which it arrives or the limitations it might contain. 5 years later, I'm still learning to unwrap that gift with gratitude rather than resentment, finding treasures hidden within experiences I would never have chosen but can no longer imagine living without. The accident taught me that survival isn't just about living through catastrophe. It's about finding ways to thrive despite permanent changes that initially seem impossible to accept or overcome. Every morning I wake up is another chance to prove that human beings are more resilient, more adaptable, and more capable of finding meaning in suffering than we ever imagined during the comfortable times when such strength seems unnecessary for daily happiness and fulfillment.